thanks for taking a moment. We're just letting some attendees log in. Welcome everybody to our webinar today on Commercial Lease Essentials, Navigating Agreements with Confidence. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name's Rebecca Nilsen. I'm a Senior Associate in LegalVision's Commercial and Leasing team here in New Zealand. And I'm joined by my colleague, Rebecca Smith, who is also an Associate in the Commercial and Leasing team. Before we get into it, there's a couple of housekeeping items. You will receive the recording and slides in your email after this is all finished. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end. We have had a number of pre-submitted questions as well, which is fantastic. So just pop those in there as they come up and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. And if you can, please complete the feedback survey after the webinar. Those things really help us make sure that these are as valuable as possible to everybody who attends them. We also have the offer where all attendees are eligible to receive a free consultation with us to discuss how we can help you with your contracts or your legal needs. To request your free consultation, you just have to give us your contact details in the survey that will appear at the end of the webinar. So we will be getting into the agenda for today. We are going to cover off the deed of lease and agreement to lease. These are the two most common documents in New Zealand for commercial leasing. We'll cover those in a little bit of detail as to what they involve, when to use them, what the commercial terms are that you might want to think about before heading into one of those negotiations. Some of the special requirements and additional terms that people do look at adding in as they go through that process, regardless of whether or not they're a tenant or a landlord. Assignment and assignment versus subletting, which is obviously very important to understand so that once you do have a lease, what can you do with it? Some key takeaways, and then hopefully we will allow enough time for Q&A at the end. We'll try not to take up all the time just chatting. So now we will get into the key details. So the agreement to lease versus the deed of lease. There is two sets of documents that are the most common in New Zealand. We do refer to them as the ADLS leasing documents. These are developed by the Law Association, which was previously known as the Auckland District Law Society, or ADLS. So the terminology does change a little bit in New Zealand, depending on who you're talking to and how new that lease document is. So if you hear us referring to either one of those, or if you hear somebody else referring to one of those, it's most likely the same thing. They do set a market standard for leasing in New Zealand, so they are the most commonly used formats. The deed of lease is the big chunky document that has all of the terms that we usually deal with, but it's really common in New Zealand for people to also have an agreement to lease or choose to go with just an agreement to lease. An agreement to lease sometimes acts the same as a heads of agreement, but it should be used primarily when conditions need to be met before the lease commences. So some of those conditions might be, if you're a landlord, for example, you might need that agreement to lease to be conditional on you kicking out an existing tenant. And you're like, I will absolutely lease this property to you, but I need them to leave first. Or it could be that you want to obtain consent, or that you're starting a new build and you want to wait until you've got all of your ducks in a row before agreeing to that tenant moving into the property. If you're a prospective tenant, there might be some conditions on you obtaining certain licenses or your business purchase going ahead, or you may be wanting the landlord to complete certain works before you agree to go ahead and formally lease that property. If there are no conditions, the agreement to lease is not usually required and you can jump straight into a deed of lease. Rebecca Smith is going to go into a little bit more detail on what you should include and consider in your agreement to lease if you're going to need one.
Thanks, Rebecca. So if an agreement to lease is needed, as Rebecca mentioned, it should include any conditions precedent to you entering a deed of lease. If those conditions are not met, then the leasing arrangement won't proceed any further. However, if the conditions are met, then the parties will enter into the negotiated terms in the document for a deed of lease. Before signing the agreement to lease, we do strongly recommend that our clients obtain a copy of that proposed deed of lease. The reason being for this is that under the standard terms of the agreement to lease, the deed of lease will be deemed to apply from signing, and both parties will be bound by the terms of the ADL lease template deed of lease, even if the parties never actually sign one. Another key component of the agreement to lease is that it should clearly outline any key commercial terms that should be included in the lease. It is important to then make sure these are then reflected in the deed of lease to ensure they continue to be binding on both parties. Rebecca is now just going to go over the deed of lease itself.
Yep. So a really common question we get following on from that is, well, if the agreement to lease implies all of the terms of the deed of lease, why would I want to go ahead and do a second document? There's a series of reasons for that, but primarily the main one, and arguably the most important one, is that the deed of lease is a much more comprehensive document. It's really common that when people are negotiating their agreement to lease, they unfortunately neglect to deal with many of the key commercial terms that should be all discussed in a deed of lease. Those things, which we will go through in a little bit more detail, are things like mechanisms for reviewing your rent, what obligations sit with the landlord and the tenant, maintenance and repair, if you want to assign your interests, and what happens if the premises that are being leased can't be used. We also have the idea of making the most of your lease involves having that deed of lease, because that means that you will be able to assign it in the future. It's really challenging to do if you don't enter into a full deed of lease and have that documented. If you're running your business out of the premises, it also just makes it easier if you're ever going to sell your business, and the lease will be included as part of that process, because all of your documentation will be thorough, detailed, and up to date. That's why we do strongly recommend that even if you are entering into an agreement to lease, that deed of lease is fully considered and negotiated before you proceed with signing either document, so that you know exactly what it is you're stepping into long term. Touched on some of those commercial terms, but they're really important to get into more detail on. So I'll let Rebecca Smith explain some of those to you.
Thanks. So in both the agreement to lease and the deed of lease, the commercial terms and ensuring these are correct are crucial. And as I said, if an agreement to lease is entered, it's critical that these are then carried through to the deed of lease itself. The key commercial terms that we recommend you check and ensure they are correct include the description of the premises. So this should include if car parking is included, and if so, we recommend specifying particular car parks where you can. For example, you might have a plan that you can attach to the lease. You want to make sure, particularly if you're operating in a busy commercial area, that your customers or the staff have access to the parks you're paying for. The other thing you need to check is the rent and the rent reviews and any rent review mechanisms. So for example, is it CPI, market, or is it fixed? In a CPI rent review, the rent will increase in relation to the percentage increase in the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of inflation that's set by Statistics New Zealand. This helps the landlord maintain the real value of the rent by accounting for the effects of inflation. The other rent review method, being a market rent review, permits the landlord to have the rent reassessed to reflect current market rental values for comparable properties in the same area. Part of this will consider whether or not there should be or is a ratchet available in the market rent review clause. This means a clause that says if the new market rent determined by a valuer is lower than the previous or current rent, the rent will stay at the current value and cannot reduce. Or there may even be an automatic increase clause regardless of what the market does. It's important, therefore, when using the market rent review method for both parties to keep an eye on where the property sits in that market. The third and final rent review method is a fixed rent review. So this is usually a fixed percentage increase each time the rent is reviewed. The benefit of this is that both the landlord and the tenant have commercial certainty as to what the rent is going to be in the upcoming years. The downfall for a landlord, though, is that they may have reviews that are less than a market rent increase. We often see a mixture of two or more of the rent review methods, for example, alternating between a market and a fixed rent review each year. Another key commercial term to consider when reviewing the lease is the outgoings, which is also sometimes known as the OPEX. So making sure that these are accurate and reflect all required outgoings under the lease. Another consideration with outgoings is the percentage of outgoings is really important. because you may only be renting part of a building, and so other tenants may be contributing to those outgoings, so making sure that your percentage is correct for your square meterage of the property you're renting. The other thing is we would recommend getting an estimate of those proposed outgoings. These should be considered as part of the costings when deciding if you're going to take over the premises or not. It is important, though, to note that outgoings are usually only an estimate of those costs, and whilst they are required to be paid regularly like rent, there may be a wash-up at the end of the year, and so landlords can then request payment where the estimate was less than the actual figure, and the tenant will be required to pay it at that stage. Another key commercial term is the start date, the term, and any options to renew. Renewals can be really valuable for tenants, particularly if you end up selling your business. The location can be a valuable asset, and the ability to stay at the same site will be crucial. It's also worth checking the permitted use. So this defines the specific purposes for which the tenant is allowed to use the leased premises. It restricts the tenant's operations to certain approved activities or business types. This provides the landlord with some protection from the tenant operating a business that could be undesirable, illegal, or inappropriate for the property or the location. You may also see security provisions, so whether it's a bank guarantee or a deposit. Landlords can request deposits be paid, which will then be put towards the first month or say 2 months rent. They may also require a bank guarantee, which protects the landlord against tenant default by providing ready access to funds that are secured by a bond issued by the tenant's bank. This will mean that the landlord can be compensated without having to go through court proceedings against the tenant. These are becoming increasingly more common requirements in commercial leasing, and we're seeing them popping up more and more often. Another common thing we see popping up in leases is guarantees. So we often recommend to landlords that they request these if the tenant is a company and obtain them from the company's directors. It provides the landlord with additional security and an avenue to take if the tenant defaults on their obligations in the lease. We also recommend any director who has been requested to provide a personal guarantee obtain some advice about how it will affect their personal situation. Make good or reinstatement provisions are another key term. So this is a requirement under the lease for the tenant to reinstate or return the leased premises to a specified condition at the end of the lease term. So it's important to have a look at these because it could be quite a costly exercise for you as a tenant if you have to reinstate. So just make sure you review that. And speaking of costs, who is responsible for the cost of the lease? So who's going to prepare it, who's paying for the negotiations, but also who's paying for the cost of any rent renewals, reviews, or assignments. Nearly through them all. There's quite a few commercial terms to get through. So then landlord's fixtures and chattels that come with the premises. So if the landlord has agreed to provide some with the premises, these should be clearly stated. For example, things like air conditioning systems, floor coverings, kitchen and bathroom fixtures, and any furniture. Further, if there is a shared space or common area, such as a staff room or bathrooms that you share with other users of the premises, so other tenants, make sure these are able to be used in your lease as well. Rebecca's now going to touch on some more special requirements that you might see in your lease as well.
Thank you. So as you can see, there are a number of commercial terms that you need to consider as you go through. And those ones are, for the most part, quite standard, and we would expect to see them negotiated in the vast majority of leases. What really good pragmatic advice and planning around your lease should do is actually take into account things that aren't necessarily your standard commercial terms and go a little bit beyond that to what will make a meaningful impact to you and your business, regardless of whether or not you're a landlord or a tenant. For example, if there's going to be a property that you want to lease and it needs to be at a certain standard for you to be able to operate your business successfully out of it, you may want to negotiate directly with the landlord if you're going to be the tenant, or vice versa, who's going to pay for those fit outs and works. Does it make sense that the landlord invests some in it themselves as well as the tenant, or is it solely going to be one party or the other? That can make a really significant commercial difference to the bottom line for both parties moving forward for that property. You can also consider incentives. So if you're the landlord and it's a difficult to lease property, or if it's a difficult to lease market, like we saw happening shortly after the COVID-19 lockdowns, You could offer incentives such as rent-free periods or early access to the property before the lease starts to enable that tenant to get set up so that the day they start paying rent, they are operational. Obviously, if you're the tenant, that's a fantastic thing to try and negotiate regardless of the market because it can really help you hit the ground running. There's also some clauses that you can look at as to special repairs and maintenance. There are standard provisions in most leases that allocate who is responsible for repairs and maintenance of the property and how that cost is going to be distributed. But every term is negotiable, and this is a quite common one that depending on what the business premises are going to be used for, you may want to negotiate one way or the other. You can also have that broad permitted use for flexibility. And the one that we're seeing happening increasingly for a lot of landlords is landlords wanting to pop in demolition clauses. These clauses allow you to give the tenant a certain amount of notice to vacate the premises if the entire property is going to be upgraded, or perhaps for you to move them to an alternative premises while you work on upgrading that one. For our landlords that have substantial property portfolios, those kinds of clauses can be really valuable, both for you as the landlord, because you have some plans in place and some flexibility as to when you're going to be able to do these works. And then as a tenant, carefully negotiating those can provide you with certainty, and it can also provide you with some commercial advantages as you move forward to be able to negotiate terms, such as if I have to move, will you help me with those costs? If I have to move, is the alternative premises going to be the same, better? Will you help me with additional marketing around our move? All those sorts of things can be negotiated and written into your deed of lease so that you have certainty that if something happens, you know exactly what kind of terms you're going to be doing it on. Speaking of things happening to your business, it may be that as you go through your journey of leasing a commercial premises, you need to assign that lease somewhere else. So I'm going to let Rebecca have a chat through what assignment looks like on most leases.
Thank you. So as Rebecca mentioned, sometimes we see tenants in a position where the premises may no longer be suitable for their business. So a great example of that is they may have outgrown the premises in a short space of time and in a faster rate than they were expecting. And so the tenant may look for a way to get out of the lease to find a new location that's more appropriate. At first instance, we would recommend that you have a conversation with the landlord. Depending on the market and the demand for commercial rentals, they actually may be willing to agree to an arrangement that will release you from your lease early. There are pros and cons for a landlord in contemplating this decision. So if there is high demand and low supply for commercial premises like the one they own, it could be worthwhile ending the current lease and entering a new one for more favourable terms. So for example, including an increase in the rent. However, if the landlord doesn't want to release you from the lease, an alternative is to try and assign your interest in the lease, though this is also subject to the landlord providing their consent. In this scenario, you would try to find a new tenant to take over the lease and your obligations under the lease for the remainder of the term. As mentioned previously, a deed of lease needs to be entered into in order to assign an interest in the lease. An agreement to lease on its own is not sufficient for this, and it's usually at a tenant's cost to have an assignment completed. We often see the words assignment and subletting used in similar contexts, but they are actually quite commercially different scenarios. And so it's really important that both tenants and landlords need to understand the differences between the two. So I'm just going to quickly touch on those for you. So assignment versus subletting. So as we quickly covered, an assignment of the lease involves transferring the entire interest in the lease from the original tenant, which we call the assignor, to a new tenant being the assignee for the remaining term of the lease. The assignee will take over all of the rights and the obligations of the original tenant under the lease. They will be responsible for paying the rent, the outgoings, and the tenant's maintenance obligations. The original tenant is released from future obligations under the lease after the lease has been assigned. If you are taking over an assignment of a lease, it is important that the date of the assignment reflects the exact date you take over the lease, so you are not liable for actions of the previous tenant while they are still in possession. The assignee is also going to be responsible for rent from the date of assignment, so you'll want to make sure you're not paying any more rent than you need to. So again, that assignment date's really important. So then subletting. So subletting involves the original tenant which becomes a sublessor, granting a sublease to another party who becomes the sublessee for a portion or all of the leased premises. The underlying deed of lease is then often referred to as the head lease. So the original tenant, or the sublessor, will still have to comply with all of their obligations under the head lease with the landlord. For example, they will still be responsible for payment of the rent and the outgoings to the landlord, and the sublessee will just pay the original tenant directly. The sublessee has rights and obligations under the sublease agreement with the sublessor. As noted above, they will pay their portion of the rent to the sublessor. If entering into a sublease, it's important to understand that the terms of the head lease will apply to the sublease. So make sure you obtain a copy of the head lease and have attached to the sublease, so you're aware of your obligations and what has been agreed to for the premises, as well as any additional obligations that are then imposed by the sublease. The sublease cannot extend beyond the term of the head lease. So when the head lease has no further rights of renewal and is brought to an end, the sublease will be brought to an end too. Both assignment and subletting require the consent of the landlord, but do provide options though if the lease arrangement as agreed is not working anymore. Now I'll hand it over to Rebecca to wind up with some key takeaways.
Thank you. So hopefully we've answered quite a lot of your questions as we've gone through, but the really important things to take away from this is that if you are looking at an agreement to lease, you need to be considering the deed of lease and all of the commercial terms. Do not think of it as a simple precursor document. This is something that can have long-lasting impacts on your commercial leasing relationship and should be carefully considered before signing. You should use it when the lease is conditional on certain actions. Otherwise, skip over it and head straight to your deed of lease. The deed of lease will be much more comprehensive than agreement to lease on its own, and it will encourage all of the parties to think through that commercial relationship really carefully and have it fully documented before proceeding. For your commercial terms, think about what is standard in a deed of lease. But remember that all commercial leasing is just a negotiation and a contract signed between two parties. So think about what's going to be really valuable to you and focus on negotiating the commercial terms that will make the biggest difference to you and your business, regardless of whether or not you're going to be the tenant or the landlord. The terms, if you do sign two documents, should mirror each other and they should be the exact same between the two. If you're going to go down the pathway of changing your lease once it's already signed, having good relationships with your landlords and tenants is critical because it means that you can have as many options as possible as you move through your leasing relationship for both assignment and subletting, whatever may suit your circumstances better. Everything typically will require some degree of consent and cooperation between the parties. So balancing what you need commercially and that commercial relationship is invaluable, even though it's not technically a legal requirement to do so. We hope you found all of the details in this webinar so far informative. You might also find our free publication, the Landlord Cheat Sheet for New Zealand leasing terms, helpful. You can download it from the resources tab in this webinar. And we also have an upcoming event shortly that may be of interest to you. It's how to franchise your business, and it will be held on Tuesday, the 23rd of July at 12 p.m. New Zealand Standard Time. You can register through our website or through the link in the slides. And we are going to get to your questions shortly. I can see quite a substantial amount have been submitted while we're live, which is great. And there was a number submitted beforehand. So we're going to do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So if you can send those through so that we can see which ones we've got. In the meantime, I'll take a quick minute to tell you about LegalVision's membership. By becoming a LegalVision member, your business would get unlimited access to our full team of over 100 specialist lawyers. And that's for all of your business as usual needs. It's like having your own in-house counsel for a fraction of the cost. And our team can assist you with things like unlimited document drafting and reviewing of business contracts, unlimited legal advice consultations, unlimited domestic trademark registrations, and so much more. We also offer a dedicated service for in-house teams and general counsel, if any of you are out there, to manage your high volume business as usual legal tasks. If you want to learn any more about how membership can help you, please just request a free consultation when the survey appears at the end of the webinar. So now we can get to some of your Q&A. So thank you so much for sending it through. So we'll start with some of the live questions that have come through since the beginning. So we have one here that says, just wants to confirm that an agreement to lease cannot be assigned, or is it just difficult to be assigned? So it does depend on the terms. So an agreement to lease isn't always in the exact same format. So there could be a term in there that says you might be able to assign this, but typically an agreement to lease cannot be assigned at all. So if you only have an agreement to lease and you get into a position where you want to assign the benefits, so you've been occupying the premises for quite some time, it would be that you would most likely end up heading down the pathway of entering into a deed of lease with your landlord so you can then assign that deed of lease. Again, that's a cooperation situation where having that good commercial relationship with your landlord will be really helpful, because if you need to adjust the documentation to be able to assign it, that's the ideal position to be in. If you have just an agreement to lease and it's on the standard form and you don't have a good relationship to your landlord, and they want to prevent you from doing it, there is no explicit right to assign it in there. So it is actually a crucially important part to go through. We've also got a question that Rebecca will probably be able to answer around annual rental increases, which is just a statement, I think. So could you talk us through annual rental increases?
I sure can. So annual rental increases are really common in commercial leasing, just so that the rent is reflective of the current market conditions. And obviously, as we're all aware currently, the market changes quite drastically in New Zealand. But it is one of those points that can be negotiated if you want them to be less frequent. Again, it's a commercial contract, so the terms are negotiable. So just work through those as part of your lease negotiations.
Cool. We've got another one that says, is it considered that the lease is bound when the agreement to lease is signed and the deed of lease is not? So when you sign the Auckland District Law Society, or the Law Society's standard agreement to lease in New Zealand, the terms of the deed of lease with the same format is considered to have been signed. So even if you don't go ahead and sign a deed of lease, it will be considered to be part of the terms. However, if you're on a non-standard agreement to lease, or if the agreement to lease has a deed of lease attached and you explicitly don't sign it and you communicate prior to signing that it's not going to be signed, or those terms aren't agreed to, that could definitely change the situation. Most common commercially, we do see people just signing the agreement to lease and the deed of lease being implied in, which as solicitors, we don't love, because it creates ambiguity in that relationship and it can lead to some pretty costly disputes down the track. So having both documents, if you are going to enter into the agreement to lease, is sort of the best case scenario. And it is possible, obviously, if you're on non-standard documents for your agreement to lease, to not have any further terms for a deed of lease, in which case that can be quite a risky situation to be in as well, because you're heading into uncharted territory where the negotiated terms aren't clear, and you could end up in a circumstance of they said, or trying to imply terms, which is a very messy situation to be in. So avoid it if possible. There's another question that's come through that said, if the landlord or tenant is responsible for repairs for weather tightness, e.g. roof repairs. Rebecca, would you like to cover this one?
Yeah, so as Rebecca mentioned, it's very dependent on your deed of lease. So whether it's a standard form, law association or ADLS lease, there is a position in there that repairs for things like weather tightness and roof repairs would become under landlord's maintenance. And again, but this can be deviated from if you don't have the standard form lease. So be really careful checking those if you aren't on the market standard, and they can make it the tenant's responsibility. But default to landlord's cost.
Perfect. We've got a question saying, Rebecca Smith mentioned that after assignment of lease, the original lessee is released from the lease obligations. Is that correct? In most circumstances, yes. Obviously, an assignment could stipulate terms that say that the original lessee will not necessarily be fully released. That is where documentation of the assignment becomes critical, and why everybody should be consulting with a legal advisor of some description before signing anything associated with the lease. For the majority of circumstances, it would be standard for the original lessee to be fully released from their obligations. Rebecca Smith, is there a limit to how much the lease rent can be increased?
That really depends on the lease itself. I mean, if you've got a fixed rent review, that it obviously can only increase by the fixed amount, but a market rent review, it will be the market. So if you've had a lease that's been provided to you that's well under market, you could see quite a dramatic increase in rent. So long story short, it really does depend on the rent review mechanism that's provided in that lease.
Yeah, cool. We've just had a clarification come through on that last one around the original lessee on assignment, which was about the guarantor. So if there is going to be an assignment that occurs, is the original guarantor fully released under the lease or not? Unfortunately, this again comes down to documentation. Sometimes it can be that the new guarantor will indemnify the old one, but it does depend on what's been agreed between the parties. Often, if you're the landlord, it is not in your best interest to release the original tenant from their guarantee, and you want that additional protection. But if that does stay in place commercially, it typically only stays in place till the end of the current term. So if you do assign a lease that's, for example, is 3 years plus a renewal right of another 3 years, and that gets assigned at year 2, you're only going to have the benefit of that for an additional year. We also have a question coming through. Where can we refer to what is the current market rent? Rebecca Smith, do you feel happy answering that one?
The current market rent?
Yeah, how do you determine current market rent?
There are professionals who do this service. So real estate agents are often a really good source of information for current market rents, property managers, and there's obviously property valuers too that can provide market data from the last 12 months, which is usually useful.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question about LV in here. So do we offer commercial negotiation services with banks and insurers outside leasing and document drafting? So yes, we do have commercial negotiation services. What they are and who we're dealing with does depend whether or not it's included in your membership. We really encourage anybody who thinks that they're going to have that volume of work to have a chat with our team, engage in one of those consultations. It's free. They're really good at explaining it. The lawyers, we focus on being lawyers and trying to know the law really, really well. But there is definitely the skills and expertise available to help you with that. We've got a question here of what are reasonable requests for a fit out from the landlord, or to negotiate what are fair responsibilities for both? That's a really good question. And there really is no specific reasonability test in this. As with all commercial negotiations, it really just depends on if it's in the interest of both parties. You do risk putting someone off if you come in with a really, really substantial request and you want them to do absolutely everything for you. But if you can see a way that it actually is commercially of benefit to both parties, there's no limitation as to what would be reasonable or unreasonable. So it's a bit of a difficult one to know without the specifics of the circumstances, but there's definitely, it's more about thinking what's in it for both parties, and can we make this something that both parties want to sign to? So what is reasonable in one city will absolutely not in another, and it could even be the same for neighbours, just because they have different commercial interests. So We've also got some more here. We've got, what is the tenant responsible for with breakages and repairs? Rebecca Smith.
So the lease will stipulate what repairs and maintenance are the tenants to complete and what are the landlord's responsibility. Again, this is another commercial thing, so it's another commercial consideration as to who's going to cover what costs. Usually if it's like wear or tear inside the property, the tenant would normally be required to keep up with their fit out and making sure it's at a reasonable standard during the term of the lease.
Yep. We've got a question here. What to do if the deed of lease contains a term that a provision can include a version change made by the landlord without approval from the tenant? So I'm going to assume that when you're saying a version change, that's, you know, the landlord changing something and is entitled to do something without the consent of the tenant. We do see things like this in deeds of leases. Some of the things are ones that I alluded to during the presentation, like a demolition clause where the landlord can say, that's it, in 6 months, you're all getting out because I want to, you know, update the premises or something like that. That's just a case of deciding whether or not it's going to work for you. And if you're still okay with the overall terms of lease, there's nothing expressly prohibiting that kind of clause. Again, because the commercial leases are so different from residential, it's really about what commercial terms you agree to. And that's part of why we do encourage upfront advice before anything's signed, even conditional agreements to lease, because of the fact that these clauses can have really substantial impacts further down the line. And if you have a 10, 20-year lease, that can have some pretty big consequences for missing at the beginning. So carefully reviewing those is there. If there's something in there that says the landlord can do it and you don't like that, you can obviously negotiate it out if it hasn't been signed. If you've already signed it and you're already bound, then you do end up in that same situation that we've been talking about where relationship is paramount, because you're going to want to say to them, can you please not? But that's a very soft, non-legal pathway to go down because the legal documentation will be very clear and binding. Let's see what else we've got. Oh, as a tenant, should I get a building report done before I enter a lease? That's a great question. Rebecca?
Yeah, that was a really good question. So we often say, and we would recommend premise condition reports are done before you take over a lease, just to really understand a tongue tie, what the premises is like and the condition of the premises, and ensure also that's fit for purpose. So you want to go in with your eyes wide open. So again, it's just one of those kind of due diligence things we'd recommend doing before you agree to a lease.
For sure. Just getting through a couple more. So someone missed the first 10 minutes, but they said, if you are under, say, a fixed term lease for 3 years, can the rent be increased within that term? So yes, it depends on whether or not there was any rent reviews. So it's not uncommon for, even if you are in a 3-year term, if your lease says that you are going to have annual rent reviews or 6 monthly rent reviews, there's no limitation as to how often a commercial lease rent can be reviewed, as long as those terms were documented and agreed to up front. It's not the same if there was no right in the lease. So it really comes down to the document and what your specific lease says. And I think there have been a few questions that have come through that are very specific to individual circumstances. So if we haven't answered one of your questions and it's a burning question and you really, really need to talk to us about it, then I'd encourage you to sign up for one of the free consultations that we do offer to our webinar attendees, provided they do so in the next 48 hours, I believe. And that way we can approach it on a much more bespoke basis. We don't want to be talking about people's confidential and specific needs on this call. If you have those sorts of questions, please feel free to go through and complete that complimentary legal consultation for the survey, through the survey at the end. And then even if you're not going to, we still would really appreciate you completing the survey. It does help us, as I mentioned at the very beginning, to make sure that these are as valuable as possible for everybody who signs up for them. We only want to do them if you're enjoying them, if you're liking them, and your feedback is absolutely crucial to helping make sure that we tweak these as we go along to give you the best value we can for your time. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate everybody who logged in and everybody who sent questions in advance. And we will look forward to hopefully speaking to you in the future.